In a nutshell, my message this evening is that companies inflicting severe damage on the environment are encouraged to continue by the corporate law. The climate emergency proves that an economy based on companies proceeding without guardrails to protect the environment from severe harm is unsustainable. Corporate directors must be obligated to protect the environment from severe harm at all times.
So our agenda, we're going to, after acknowledgement of country, we're going to have our presentation by Robert Hinkley, and then we're allowing quite a bit of time for question and answer and a real discussion about how this code for corporate citizenship could evolve and how it could take off and grow support. And then we're going to finish off with some calls, some actions and some next steps. But we can't go anywhere further forward without really taking a really big deep breath and saying, what a beautiful place we live. And on behalf of the organising team, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people here today. Geelong Sustainability is a key supporter of the Uluru Statement, and we will be campaigning for the Voice and the Vote Yes campaign that is going to kick off. And the other part of this beautiful country is the Wadawurrung's Healthy Country Plan. And that's another thing which, if you've not gone and watched their short little video, I really do encourage you to visit their website and have a look. It's wonderful. And we've got so much to learn from them when it comes to their stewardship of the land. Good on. Right. So now I'm going to hand over to Nick Pate from the Sustainable Hour and the Centre for Corporate Citizenship, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much and welcome. So how do we feel, everyone? Feeling good? When I asked that question, I actually didn't mean how do you feel today. I meant, how do we feel about the world, the climate, all these bigger questions?
Anxious.
Concerned, anxious. These are the words that I hear when I talk with people, especially maybe in this year, 2023. Anxiety, a feeling that it's not going as it should. And as a climate movement, questioning, are we doing good enough? Is everything that we've tried working? These kind of reflections. I think we live in a time where a lot of us, when we open our TV screens, we see confrontation. We see an escalation of conflict. We see opposing sides that just can't agree. And we get this feeling that it's getting worse. There seems to be money enough for weapons, including submarines, but not for taking action on climate. Short-sightedness and greed is the name of the game. And it appears as if the bad guys, the greedy guys out there, seem to have sat down on the structures of power and they rule our country. So there's this sense of discouragement. People are telling me, we're losing. So what does it matter? Look at even the United Nations. The biggest authority we have on the planet is now run, or the next climate summit is run by a fossil fuel executive. What's going on? I'm not going to go into all the figures and numbers about how much profit the fossil fuel companies are making as we speak. But just take this one figure down. $600 billion last year. That's what's estimated when you look at the annual accounting from these companies, just the 20 biggest of them. $600 billion in profit. And then we have studies that show that every year at the moment, we're seeing damage, indirectly or directly, from these fossil fuel companies to the scale of more than $300 billion. So anyway, if we take a look at this graph, I think that is maybe the clearest sign when people feel discouraged. Because what does it all matter? Can we see any sign that the United Nations meeting 29 times soon, every year, to discuss the climate at a global level, and all the climate activists around the world that are blockading the streets and demonstrating and sending letters to their politicians and holding meetings and the rest, can we see any effect of that on the graph that shows the rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere? I don't know. Can you? I can't. Not at all. We have all this myriad of different campaigns going on in all the corners. We're trying to stop fracking. We're stopping logging in the forest. We're stopping methane leaks. We're getting better at recycling. We want better fuel efficiency standards. There's all these things that the climate movement is trying to do, but they're all small and little in the corners. That's why, about 2 months ago, when I had a conversation with someone on the phone, his name was Robert Hinkley, and he said he was a former corporate lawyer. And he told me something that really got my attention. Because what he was talking about was at a much bigger scale than any of all this that I was concerned about as a climate activist here in Geelong. First of all, he said, there's something wrong with the law. The corporate law has a flaw, he said. A flaw? And then he talked about responsibility. That directors have a responsibility and we need to redefine that responsibility. And that needs to be written in the law. Now I was listening. And out of that listening came a long interview. We did an hour interview for the Sustainable Hour, a podcast where we talk about the simple idea that Robert Hinkley is going to introduce to you tonight, and that we're going to hear your reactions to and have a discussion about. Because in a way, we're testing the grounds tonight. This is a global launch of the idea in front of an audience in this way. And we want to hear your reactions because maybe we need to take this further. Let's decide that tonight. So, who's Robert Hinkley? And I'm quoting here from the newspapers who wrote last week. Both our free newspapers here in Geelong had articles about this event. And I think they wrote beautifully. I couldn't have said it better. Robert Hinkley is a retired corporate lawyer with more than 20 years experience. 20 years experience advising large companies in Australia and in the United States. He was a partner in the leading US firm Skadden, Arps, Slade, Meagher and Flom, as well as being a principal advisor to the US Department of Justice in its investigations of investment banks for their role in the global financial crisis. And these investigations recovered penalties and fines of more than $65 billion US. Congratulations with that. And you have been awarded already. Robert Hinkley, let's hear what you have to say. The word is yours.
Thank you, Mick. I hope I can live up to that billing. We'll see. First, I too want to acknowledge the Wathaurong people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet this evening, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Before starting, I'd like to thank the conveners of tonight's program, the Center for Climate Safety, Geelong Sustainability, and ADDIC, a different approach to community. Specifically, I'd also like to thank Mick Ite, Vicky Perrette, and Rob Patterson, without whose hard work and collaboration, this event would not have occurred. Finally, I'd like to thank the library and Rob Patterson, the convener of ADDIC, for being our host this evening. I need a show of hands. How many of you think we can do something to relieve the climate emergency we're now facing? Raise your hands. Oh, this is a good crowd. How many thinks it's already too late? Anybody? How many aren't sure? There we go. I'm not sure I know. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a corporate lawyer, a retired corporate lawyer at that. I do know, however, that there's a flaw in the corporate law, which is contributing to the crisis. I'm here to identify that flaw and to suggest a strategy for fixing it. But first, I want to thank all of you for your time. I know it is valuable, and there are probably lots of things you'd rather do on a Thursday evening than listen to a corporate lawyer. I'm grateful you're here to participate, listen, and ask questions. I hope at the end of the evening, you will consider your time well spent. They say an idea gets better the more you share it. The Code for Corporate Citizenship, which I'm going to speak about tonight, is a simple idea. My hope is that after leaving here tonight, you will feel more empowered and will share it widely. In a nutshell, my message this evening is that companies inflicting severe damage on the environment are encouraged to continue by the corporate law. When governments of the world are unable to stop the damage, it continues to build. To prevent this, I believe the profit motive in the corporate law must be modified to make corporations less destructive from the day they are organized. I call this solution the Code for Corporate Citizenship. When in the future, a company is discovered to be severely damaging the environment, the code will require its directors, its own directors, to make it stop, regardless of whether the company is complying with other existing law. Winston Churchill once said about Americans, which I'll plead guilty to that, but I'd say it's probably true about all democracies. They always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Over the last 30 years, we've tried numerous ways to halt the global emission of greenhouse gases. 27 conferences of the parties on the environment have been held where the nations of the world got together and pledged to do something about the problem. Delegates to the COPs then returned home and proposed new laws to restrict greenhouse gas emissions. Economist investment bankers got into the act and offered carbon trading, carbon taxes, and carbon offsets. Accountants suggested requiring the disclosure of carbon footprints. And finally, socially responsible investing and corporate social responsibility movement, now called ESG, standing for companies showing more respect for the environment, society, and good corporate governance, have each tried to entice industry to cut emissions voluntarily. But overall, these strategies have had little success. Global emissions continue to rise. What was a potential problem when we started has now become an emergency. The code is a new idea that, whatever the outcome of the current crisis, will prevent a similar-led environmental disaster, corporate environmental disaster, from occurring down the road. Now, before going too far, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in Sydney, not the one north of here, home of the team that can't seem to beat the Cats, a small rural community in upstate New York, population 5,800, spelled with an I. I graduated from the Jesuit University of New York City, Fordham, with a degree in finance and later from its law school. After graduating, I joined a leading New York firm by the name of Skadden Arps, Slate, Marr & Flom, and I practiced corporate law, specializing in mergers and acquisitions and capital raising. Now, in 1983, I was very fortunate to be introduced to Australia when I represented Perth-based entrepreneur Alan Bond, who was refinancing his acquisition of the Swan Brewery in WA. During that transaction, I did get to spend a couple of weeks in Newport, Rhode Island, watching Alan and the crew of Australia 2 win the America's Cup. I was on the right side. 6 years later, I was recruited back to Skadden to open and head up their new office in Sydney. Over the next 18 years, I helped dozens of Australian companies and their US investment bankers raise billions of dollars in the US capital markets. I became an Australian citizen in 2007, together with my wife Annie, who's sitting right there in the third row, and our son Jack, who has just started his working career back in Sydney, the one spelled with a Y on the inferior football team. I retired a little over 3 years ago after spending 10 years in Washington, D.C., working for the US federal government, helping it understand what caused the financial crisis of 2008. That's a whole nother topic. While working for the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission in 2010, a colleague of mine and I uncovered the huge fraud in the market for residential mortgage-backed securities. Then, from 2012 to 2020, I became the principal advisor to the US Department of Justice regarding the fraud. In that role, I helped US attorneys' offices across the country by showing them how the fraud occurred, where they would find the documents that papered the fraud, and how the defenses the banks were offering were without substance. As Mick said earlier, as a result of those investigations, we recovered more than 65 billion US dollars from over a dozen banks. My legal education taught me how corporations were governed. My experience as a capital markets attorney gave me insight in how big businesses were run, how they were financed, and how their boardrooms functioned. Now, about 20 years into my career, I was having lunch with a friend of mine who was the head of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies and a professor of social policy at Sydney University. He was interested in getting Australian companies to pay more attention to human rights in the workplace, especially as it pertained to Australian companies' Asian subsidiaries. He asked me, he said, "Bob, why is it that when I talk to Australian CEOs, they don't seem to care about human rights? It's not like they're against it, or it's not like they're against the idea. It just doesn't seem to matter to them." Like any corporate lawyer would, I knew the answer. I replied, they don't see it as part of their job description. They see their job as simply making money for shareholders. To the extent human rights is even a factor, they know they must comply with laws which protect human rights. But it's the company's lawyers who are responsible for the oversight of that. CEOs know that human rights laws in Asia are more lax than they are in Australia. However, as opposed to something they think they must change, they may even see it as an opportunity that gives their company a competitive edge. "Great," he said to me. "Write me a chapter for a book I'm editing. I want that explanation to be part of it." I wrote the chapter and have been thinking about my answer and its implications ever since. Tonight I want to speak to you about how that conversation relates to the climate emergency we are now all facing. First, let me suggest that company managers treat the environment very much like they treat human rights in the workplace. Environmental laws differ from place to place. Company managers tend to cut emissions to the level the law requires. When cutting emissions further costs more, there's very little incentive for them to do it. Secondly, I'd like to dispel the myth that greenhouse gas emissions continue because corporate managers are greedy. It's not the personal greed of managers that keeps the emissions going. It's the law which encourages them to continue and discourages them from stopping. That's what I'm here to discuss tonight. In more than 30 years of private practice, I never had a business person come to me and say, I got this great idea for a business. It'll make a lot of money. Yeah, it will, it's unethical or it's immoral, or it'll be highly destructive, but it'll make a lot of money. In my experience, business doesn't work that way. What usually happens is that companies become successful, and then, through advancements in science, are discovered to be causing severe harm to the environment or otherwise causing severe harm to the public interest. The decision to enter into that business was made years ago by people who were no longer part of management, no longer directors. The people who made that decision had no way of knowing or foreseeing that the long-term consequences of their decision. Now the problem is inherited by their successors. A perfect example of this are companies in the electricity generation and motor vehicle manufacturing businesses, which cause the emission of large quantities of greenhouse gases. When they started, no one knew that burning fossil fuels would result in the current climate emergency. This only became evident years later, after the companies had billions invested in plant, equipment, and technology. This is where the existing law that tells directors what to do lets us down. It commands them to act in the best interest of the corporation. In Australia, it's in Section 181 of the Corporations Act. This provision, however, is not unique in Australia. Very similar provisions are contained in the corporate laws of the 50 states in America, the European Union, and almost every country of which I am aware. This provision recognizes the profit motive and gives company their direction. Missing is any requirement to safeguard the environment or protect the rights or property of others. In other words, the law tells directors to pursue the company's self-interest without including any guardrails. To the extent companies cause harm to the environment or others, government must then contain that behavior by passing additional regulation later. We tend to take the lack of consideration for the public interest as the way business must be. We think incorrectly that it has always been this way and we should expect no more. But that's not true. It hasn't always been this way, and it needn't be so in the future. Legal scholars know that governments once kept corporations on a much shorter leash. The law provided that companies which harmed the public interest could lose their charter, their license to operate. Then, in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution started to get traction, and governments decided they needed to compete to get companies to set up in their jurisdiction. in what is now referred to as the race to the bottom by legal commentators, government took down the guardrails, the requirement that companies not harm the public interest. Now, this didn't pose a serious problem back then. Companies were small, they acted mainly locally, and they employed relatively primitive technology. But it does today. When some companies employ tens of thousands, are backed by billions of dollars in capital, and operate all over the world using modern technology. Enough history as to how we got here. So what should directors do today when they discover their business is causing severe harm to the environment? Their company is complying with all laws and is highly profitable. Closing its destructive operations will involve writing off billions. Modifying those operations may involve new research and development at a high cost and risk. The corporate law says the directors are acting in the best interest of the corporation without any need to protect the environment. In these circumstances, it is unlikely, as we have seen, directors will decide to stop or modify their business to make it less destructive. How could that be in their company's best interest? Rather, it's more likely they'll spend millions greenwashing or lobbying politicians to prevent changes in the law which could make the damage stop. They might cut back on the damage they're causing if the cost is small or the public relations value is high. But when the costs are high, companies aren't going to incur these costs by stopping or changing voluntarily. This is how the law encourages directors to let their company's destructive behavior continue. Worse, it actually justifies it. Let me explain why this is a problem, especially for democracies. When individuals or companies cause harm, governments are supposed to respond by passing laws which require them to change their behavior. The new laws carry penalties, which government is supposed to use to punish violators and deter others. At least that's the theory. When it works, and it works most of the time, the destruction stops. The people's security and the public interest is preserved. This is the benefit we all receive, when we give up a portion of our freedom and agree to be ruled by a government of laws. But what happens in the situation when government is unable to pass laws protecting the environment from severe harm? We can see it now every day. The destruction continues. This is the position we are now in with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. When the damage can't be stopped, people can lose faith in their democracy. Worse, they can lose hope for the future. It's time to recognize democracies can't always pass new laws protecting us from corporate destructive behavior, and start looking for solutions which eliminate the possibility of that behavior arising in the first place. Now, I have some experience with this, being an American, or originally an American. America's inability to do something about the gun problem is a good example. Slavish adherence to the Second Amendment right to bear arms in the United States Constitution results in hundreds of mass killings every year, as you would be aware. Maybe it's time to recognize the amendment was adopted when bearing arms meant single-shot muskets and mass shootings were not a problem. Its repeal may be necessary in a world of automatic weapons. But also, think about this. Why should government grant a charter and limited liability to companies which sell military-grade weapons to ordinary citizens? Does that make sense to anybody? Not in Australia, I'm sure of that. But also, I have another example, and it's not just particular to America. Smoking is a good example. Government knows it can't criminalize smoking, but it didn't work in America with alcohol, and it won't work with tobacco. But why should government grant charters and limited liability to companies which engage in the mass manufacture and distribution of a product which kills 8 million people every year? Without infringing on anyone's right to smoke, the elimination of these companies' ability to sell tobacco products would prolong the lives of millions and save billions in public health care costs. Smoking would become a much smaller problem. But let's get to what we're here for tonight. The emission of greenhouse gases is another good example. Government's inability to pass laws one jurisdiction at a time which will limit global emissions to safe levels is now readily apparent, and to many of us, frustrating. Big companies continue to emit greenhouse gases at record levels, as Nick's slide showed you earlier. Carbon is accumulating in the atmosphere, temperatures are rising. Whether you blame government's inability on corporate lobbying or something structural in the political system, it doesn't matter. Big companies and few industries are causing severe harm, and governments of the world can't seem to be able to bring it to an end. So how do we change that? In each of these three examples, guns, smoking, and greenhouse gas emissions, governments formed to protect the public interest, including the environment, grant charters to large institutions, that is, corporations. Some of those institutions knowingly continue to cause severe harm, which governments then find impossible to stop. If governments can't force companies to stop inflicting severe damage on the planet and on us, there is only one solution: create less destructive corporations. Instill in the corporate system a self-regulatory mechanism, that is, a moral compass or conscience, that makes them stop on their own. A kill switch, if you will, on the pursuit of profit at the expense of severe harm to the environment. The law must be changed to make it clear that severely destructive corporate behavior is no longer acceptable. When it becomes clear a company is causing severe harm, its management must take responsibility for the ongoing damage and begin to act in the public interest until it stops. Under existing law, directors have one commandment: to act in the best interest of the corporation. The code would give them another: that they not allow their company to cause severe harm to the environment. Or as has been summarized by Nick tonight, it's 11 words. Yes, you're supposed to act in the best interest of the corporation, but not at the expense of severe harm to the environment. Once enacted, the law will state clearly that all companies are required to be more socially responsible, at least to the point of not causing severe harm to the environment. When they go over that line, they will become liable for continuing damage and be subject to the costs associated with stopping or modifying their destructive behavior. This will thus introduce a threat that directors will not be able to ignore, will constantly monitor for, and be sure to take steps to avoid. Nobody wants their company to be forced to incur those costs. It will change the mindset of directors at every company, not just those that today are causing severe harm. All directors will understand they now have a responsibility to make sure their company doesn't severely damage the environment. That's not too much to ask, is it? Senior managers and other employees will quickly become aware of the director's additional responsibility and will incorporate it into their business plans and strategies. The code will empower all corporate personnel to raise concerns for the environment whenever new plans raise the potential for it to be severely harmed. Importantly, those concerns will be raised before companies already have billions invested. A call to action. Corporations should not be allowed to continue running roughshod over the environment. So how do we make it the law? Each of us can do something to help enact the code and bring destruction of the environment to an end. Talk up the code to your friends, family, and member of parliament. Visit our website, www.supportthecode.au. Often. It will change on a regular basis. Sign the open letter there in support of the code. If you have the time and skills and like to contribute, contact me or one of our conveners this evening, the Center for Climate Safety, Geelong Sustainability, or ADEC. If you belong to an environmental group already which doesn't yet support the code, propose to them that they do. There are thousands of environmental groups all over the world separately combating climate change. Most focus on reducing emissions locally. They should be encouraged to advocate for the code's enactment. It's possible to do both. Go after the common cause of their separate problems, as well as to work to contain local outbreaks. Doing both will enhance each of their individual organizations' prospects for success. Now, no matter how reasonable it seems, our elected representatives will not amend the Corporations Act to include the code on their own initiative. They must be encouraged to do so by the people they represent, us. In the near future, we'll be asking you to contact your local member of parliament in support. The code should not be a partisan issue. It isn't a matter of being on one side of the business regulation debate or the other. It's a matter of deciding whether we want businesses to be able to continue inflicting severe harm on the environment when government can't make it stop. No one should be in favor of that. All candidates running for office in the next federal election should be asked if they support the code. There's little doubt that the companies which are most responsible for the climate crisis and have opposed efforts to curb their emissions until now will oppose the code. Do not be afraid of them. Their numbers are very small. Big companies do not always win. Public opinion is growing in support of the idea that companies should be less destructive. One of my favorite quotes from Mahatma Gandhi is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they argue with you, then you win. Conventional wisdom regarding corporate behavior has moved a long way in the last 25 years, and I will say even in the right direction. Sometimes it's one step forward and two steps back, but mostly it's moved in the right direction. In April 2000, the Australian Financial Review ran an op-ed I wrote on the code under the subtitle, "The Profit Motive can work with a moral motive. It was treated as sort of a man bites dog story. Corporate lawyer suggests corporations should be tamed. Some of my friends in the corporate law community said to me, "Good luck with that, Bob." Back then, however, the corporate social responsibility movement was in its infancy. The term ESG, which replaced it, hadn't even been coined yet. Socially responsible investing consisted of a few mutual funds with less than $10 billion under management. Shortly thereafter, in September 2000, the American magazine Business Week published a poll which asked Americans which of the following statements did they agree with more strongly. The first statement: companies should sometimes sacrifice profits in order to protect employees and the communities in which they operate. The second statement was companies should only be concerned with the pursuit of profit, and that will be best for the American economy. The second statement, by the way, was the then position of the American Business Roundtable, an organization of 200 CEOs of America's largest companies. And I'll point out as well that the first statement sort of reflects about what we're talking about with the code. Now, the result of that poll was a surprise. Remember, it's 2000. Things haven't changed yet, or at least we didn't think they'd changed. 94% of Americans said they agreed more strongly with the first statement than with the second. For many, it was a shock to find out they were part of a huge majority. Loosely translated, we all knew something was wrong with the corporate system, but we didn't realize that almost everyone else felt that way as well. Business started to get the message. Their customers wanted them to be less destructive. Consultancies sprang up to advise companies on how they could improve their brands by being more socially responsible. Business schools started to teach it. Socially responsible investing started to take off. Corporate social responsibility took on a new name, ESG. In a little more than a decade, ESG has become a business discipline like accounting, finance, management, and marketing. Every business school now teaches it. Most major corporations at least pay lip service to it. Proponents of socially responsible investing now boast that more than $30 trillion is under socially responsible management. That tells you what investors want, doesn't it? In 2019, the Business Roundtable changed its position and determined that, in addition to shareholders, corporations should take into consideration various elements of the public interest, including the environment and the interests of employees, customers, and the communities in which the company operates. Today, most businesses recognize the value of being perceived green. Public relations people talk about how their companies take the environment into consideration. Now, taking the environment into consideration is fine for the vast majority of companies which aren't causing a severe harm to the environment anyway. However, it's insufficient for those emitting significant quantities of greenhouse gases. These companies need to be pushed to do more than just take the environment into consideration. The code will do just that. The evidence is clear. People want their businesses to protect the environment. The technology is there to do it. It's time the burning of fossil fuels to generate electric power or power our motor vehicles passed into history. The code will make it the law. As Churchill might say, if he were still here, we've tried everything else, now's the time to do the right thing. In conclusion, I want to say that democracy is a system of government that depends heavily on its citizens' self-regulatory respect for the environment and the public interest. It's called citizenship. Creating large institutions with all the rights of citizenship and none of its obligations was probably never going to end well. The climate emergency proves that an economy based on companies proceeding without guardrails to protect the environment from severe harm is unsustainable. Corporate directors must be obligated to protect the environment from severe harm at all times. Whenever a company is discovered to be severely damaging the environment, the code will require its own directors to make it stop. Raising the bar on corporate behavior in this manner will protect the earth and inure to the highest good of all. Please start sharing the code with your friends, family, and elected representatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's time to hear what you think about what Robert has told us here. It's time for questions and discussion. And in order for many of us to be able to voice, to keep your questions short and also keep your answers short.
I'm a lawyer. It's very hard for a lawyer.
I have a question about corporations that are not Australian. So there's a number of corporations from other countries who are doing stuff here, from India and China and places like that. Will this corporate law apply to them, or will it just remove, I'm wondering whether it would remove Australian competition so that other corporations from overseas can just come in and do what they like?
That's a very good question. It's one I get asked quite a bit. Tonight I was talking about changing Section 180 of the Corporations Act. There's two answers to your question. The first is that if Australia changes Section 181 of the Corporations Act, it can also change the provision with regard to foreign corporations doing business in Australia in a similar manner. But the second answer, which is really the better answer, is that the beauty of the code is that it's a really simple change, and it changes the same law, more or less, the world over. So we're starting in Australia, and I think it's great that we're starting in Australia, but it should be copied by countries all over the world. I mean, I'll tell you, last year or 2 years ago, the European Union decided there was something wrong with the duty of directors, and they thought that maybe the way to fix it was to change the law to make them behave in a more sustainable manner. The problem with that is it gets really complicated. So that even though the European Parliament passed it and asked the executive to get the 27 members of the union to make it part of their corporate law, it ran into a snag. I think because it was just too complicated. I think the beauty of the code is it's simple, and who's against prohibiting corporations from causing severe harm to the environment? Anybody? No.
Corporations.
Well, there are a few. There are a few that are earning a pretty good living that Mick referred to off of emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But you know what? Even they understand their time to make hay in that market is over. You know, we drove down here today and we're coming through Victoria, and there are solar farms all over. So Annie says to me, look up who owns those damn things. Because she didn't say damn things, I would have said that. And I look it up, sure, it's a big fossil fuel burning company. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Annie and I had a debate about that. But they're getting out of one means of generating electricity and into one that isn't as damaging. They see the handwriting on the wall. So that should make it easier.
Anyone else got a question?
Does the code make the directors personally liable?
It isn't structured like typical business regulation, where if you generate or you discharge more parts per billion of a toxic chemical than another, then the company may have to pay a fine. Okay, and most corporate regulation doesn't make directors liable. But the code is better in that it causes directors to realize there's a big risk out there. If they end up causing severe damage to the environment, for instance, by emitting significant quantities of greenhouse gases, their directors are going to have an obligation to change and make it stop. So what it does is it affects corporate behavior, not by threatening them within an inch of their lives of monetary damages, but by threatening their company with maybe its very existence. And directors, they understand financial risk. And not only directors, but investors. I always tell people you can't pass the code on Tuesday and have it take effect on Wednesday. There's just too many businesses out there that you just can't shut down. But you know, we haven't tried to shut down electric power generators or motor vehicle manufacturers on Wednesday. Well, what they're talking about, and they've always talked about, is, well, in this country, is whether it's going to be 2035 or 2050. I think it can be a lot closer to 2027 or 2030. And what's going to happen when that law comes in? Wall Street, or the Australian equivalent, the investors are going to want to know what kind of progress the company is making in getting out of what they're doing and into something that isn't going to run afoul of the code. So that's how the code works. It basically, it scares the hell out of directors that they might lose their company if they get found in that position. And that changes the dynamic within companies as well. Managers and employees, they're going to get, instead of get paid to hide problems, they're going to get paid to identify problems. And I think that's a big change that it's going to change the mindset of companies. It's also going to change the mindset of directors, of legislators, and it's going to change the mindset of the public as well. No longer are we going to expect corporations to do the worst. We're going to know they have a duty not to cause severe harm. Did I go too long, Vicky?
Yes.
Sorry.
Robert, thank you for a terrific address. I'm slightly embarrassed because I think you've answered the question that's been gnawing at me, and that was, should there be some transitional provision to make it politically more palatable to and more realistic from the corporation's point of view? Not that I have any sympathy for them, but and I was thinking in terms of some clarity being around the proposition that they have a certain amount of time to comply absolutely with this provision.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go. I think in the United States, if you didn't go that way, you might have a constitutional problem, actually. I mean, companies have been allowed to run their business like this for a long time. So they probably ought to be given some leeway in terms of getting out of this business. But saying that, I think as a result of the pressure brought by investors, they'll be doing it quicker than the deadlines require. I always seem to want to get a question from a law professor.
Yeah.
So Robert, first of all, thank you very much. I think we are 100% on the same page with this whole initiative. It's fantastic. and you know I've written on this. And
Actually, Professor Duplessis is an expert on the duty of directors under the corporate law. So written several articles.
Thank you very much. I just want to make sure that people know that this particular section 181, subsection A, the best interests of the corporation, has been considered in 2006 by 2 commissions or committees in Australia, and in both instances they concluded we don't need to change anything. Not at all. Because they said directors can take into consideration all other interests, also the interests of the environment. And then the Australian Institute of Company Directors in 2022 did a survey, and they once again said, well, it's fine, this is what we want. So the question that I have is, and well, I can just make one more comment. I was a panel member at the retirement of Professor Ian Ramsay end of last year, and there was Justice Finkelstein there. And I said to him, this particular section is the elephant in the room, because the interpretation of what's the best interest of the corporation is wrong. It's absolutely wrong. So that's why we're on the same page. And I said, why don't, and he agreed, but I said, why is the law not changing? He said there's no political way, will, and to change it, and that business is so strong that it will not change. So I really am absolutely with you, but we need to be realistic as to what we can achieve. And we need to do what you said, keep on promoting changes, but I'm a little bit skeptical. I've done research for 20 years and I'm a little bit skeptical.
We always get to this, the lawyers, one way and then the other, right? Well, Professor Zhang, first thing I'll say about the Australian Institute of Company Directors, they're a great organization, but they're a trade association. Okay, they do what their members, or what they think their members want. My thinking on this subject has evolved over 20 years. And you'll notice when I talk about the code, there's a word in there that probably is a little bit, I wonder what that means. And that word is severe, okay? Now there's a reason for that, okay? Corporate lawyers, they know about Section 181. The corporate directors are supposed to act in the best interest of corporations. Do you think companies ever lose money? Do you think when those companies lost money, the directors acted in the best interest of the corporation? The answer is probably not, but you don't take directors to court over that because of something in the law, something that the courts have imposed in the law called the business judgment rule. And it says we're not going to spend all our time second guessing directors' decisions. They're business people. As long as they take those decisions in good faith, we're not going to overturn them. Otherwise, we're going to spend all our time in court listening to dissatisfied shareholders. So, but the point is, that didn't totally neuter act in the best interest of the corporation. The courts still will listen to cases where corporate directors stole a corporate opportunity or committed fraud on the shareholders by misleading them. One commentator that I knew a long time ago back in Washington, D.C. said that basically the business judgment rule reduces the duty of directors to thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not lie. But the point is that there is still some corporate directors' behavior that everybody recognizes is over the line. And the reason severe is in the Code for Corporate Citizenship is that I think there are some instances of corporate behavior which there's very little disagreement is causing severe damage to the environment. And clearly with the UN's position on it, the American Business Roundtable, everybody sees the problem that's being caused. The European Parliament, there's no doubt that these companies are causing severe harm. Even they know it, okay? They're just trying to drag it out in terms of how long they change their business.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Robert. It seems to me that when you try and introduce change, particularly in Australia, it inevitably gets politicised. And with the help of the conservative press, very few people can often effectively run effective scare campaigns. I'm thinking in terms of, well, you know, the Murdoch press and that sort of thing.
I come from America, I understand the press. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you think that sort of problem should be addressed? Because it seems to me that would be the major problem. These scare campaigns that always get up, you know, you only have to look at the most recent election.
Well, you know, Rupert isn't an idiot, okay? Well, he might be, I'm not going to go there. The defamation laws in this country are too strict. But if 94% of people think that corporations shouldn't be allowed to cause severe harm to the environment, I'm not sure you're going to see them try to make too much hay on that. I mean, nobody's trying to shut Rupert down or change his operations at this point. There is one very small target but not at the expense of severe damage to the environment, is directed at. And as I said, even that target understands its time is pretty much up. So hang in there. I mean, I can tell you big companies don't always win. There's 15 banks in America that paid $65 billion for what they did in the financial crisis. Nobody thought they were going to lose.
Robert, two quick questions.
Another law professor, folks.
From different universities.
Wow, yeah. You were saying the better university. Sorry.
Well, I'm more optimistic than Jean is about your idea and the prospects. But two quick comments and then a question. Firstly, there's a lot of concern about the power of corporations and what the corporations will do. We often forget that corporations don't exist. They are legal constructs. We've created them. You can touch members, you can touch the people, and that's precisely what your idea does.
Absolutely right.
So we shouldn't be too concerned about corporations and don't expect anything of a corporation. It's a legal person. It's a fiction. It doesn't exist. It can't act ethically or morally because it's not a person. So that's one thing. And your idea places the focus on the people.
Yes, the directors, the people who are responsible for running the company.
Secondly, while you were speaking, you might have seen years ago Joel Balkin's The Corporation. If not,
absolutely,
it's available on YouTube for free. Watch that. What he did was, for instance, apply the psychological indications to the psychological profile of a company and came to the conclusion it's a psychopath.
Okay. That's exactly right.
And that is why psychopaths will oppose these ideas. And they might question. You've addressed severe. But what about cause and environment? How do you define environment for purposes of the code? Because we can get kind of severe impact at the local level. In Geelong, would that fall within the ambit, or are you thinking of things at a global level? Because then a number of them will immediately say, but cows do more damage, cows emit more gas than we do.
Actually, they don't, but that's the well, maybe than you or I do, but not automobiles and coal-fired power plants.
Suddenly we were in a causation argument that would, and have you given thought to that?
Yes, quite a bit, actually. And tonight my address was about mostly generating electricity with fossil fuels and running motor vehicles. If you look, I think that the the latest statistics show that they generate about 47% of all greenhouse gases. So that makes them a big target, and it's global. The code will not be used to shut down a local business because it's having an adverse effect on Geelong or Sydney. We're talking about a severe impact worldwide, I guess. There may be a day, Professor Louis, where the code evolves so that all corporate behavior tries to do as little damage to the environment and other elements of the public interest, like the public health and safety, the dignity of employees, the welfare of our communities, human rights, that companies change their mindset to such an extent that our economy no longer operates on the basis of pursuing self-interest without guardrails, but without severe interest to any of these severe adverse effect to the environment or any of these other things as well. I think what this can do is it can get people thinking about how do we reduce the adverse footprint companies have overall and historically. Essentially what I'm saying, it might be an evolutionary change.
So I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on your different interpretations of severe that different corporations could potentially take to essentially mean that they can get away with a hell of a lot before they get to that point?
But the incentive is not to get away with more and more. It's always to not get near severe. You're talking to an old securities lawyer and an American securities lawyer. The general rule in issuing prospectuses in the United States has always been you can't use a false statement or a misleading statement or omission. And misleading was never really defined. It's got to be material, it's got to be important, but we never defined it down to the nth degree. And what that did was it made U.S. prospectuses actually we used to be the blue ribbon of investing, because investors knew that they were being told the truth. Okay? Now, not causing severe damage. Companies love to have you define something in a statute, because as you define it, you make other things legal. And so the purpose of leaving the word severe in is to scare them that they don't know and encourage others to do the right thing and to identify things that are headed in the wrong direction. So that's why it is, that term is used.
Leave it broad.
Leave it uncertain so that it results in risk that they want to avoid.
Not an academic like these gentlemen. I run a very small social enterprise here in Geelong, and I can't help but feel that we're also integrated in the whole global economy in many ways, where it doesn't matter it matters to me on a local level what decisions I and my team make about the items that we purchase and the way we go about things that matters. So, we consume a lot of materials, we promote bicycling and all that kind of stuff, and we try to reduce carbon footprint, but at the same time, we receive items from around the world. The bikes that we sell are made from manufacturers all around the world and manufactured in a certain country and rebuilt here. Yeah, so, how does what you're relating to relate to us? How do we change our behavior as well? Because I feel that's really important too.
Well, I would suggest, do you have less than $100 million worth of revenues?
Yes.
Okay. I doubt that you're causing severe harm to the environment. So you see, often when businesses are faced with regulation, what's the first thing they do? They get somebody like you to say it's going to adversely affect him. This isn't about that. This is about the less far less than 1% of all businesses that are causing the problem. And by imposing the code on them, not only will it make the world a better place, it'll make the other 99% plus businesses better off as well. What you'll be doing is you'll be buying parts and bicycles and from companies that are bigger and have had to change their operations to make them less environmentally damaging.
Hello, how are you going?
I'm going well.
That's good. Great to hear. Given this crisis is...
Until the last question. The last question is always the killer.
Given this crisis is transnational, when we talk about a code, we're talking about a code here in the Western world. The change is happening so fast. First of all, do you think we've got time to bring a code in through a democratic process as far as when that could be put into law, how it could be, where the influence would come from, and whether the corporations would be put under any pressure from the particular governments? Going transnational, what about non-Western countries? Let's go to China. Now, everyone now refers to China, of course, put it in the context of being a authoritarian capitalist state. How could a code find a way in there, and the same corporations that profit on Chinese soil also profit here and all over the world, but those corporations can act differently in China to the way they act here. So how can we focus on one corporation that's in more than one political environment and see that the code could be a major focus for the whole company?
You've asked a lot of questions there. I'm not sure you're aware of it, but I'm going to answer the first one, and then I'm going to let you raise additional questions that I haven't. And that is, the code affects the corporation at the parent level in the country where they are incorporated, and it affects them worldwide. Okay, it's because it affects the board of directors. It tells directors what their job is. Their job is different now. They got to take care of the environment or not cause severe harm to it. So if, I don't know, pick a local company here that has operations in China. If the law is passed in Australia, if the code is passed in Australia, it'll affect its operations in China. And you know what? The Chinese, they don't want to damage the environment any more than anybody else does. They're going to adopt the technology as it develops. And I'm not sure the Chinese government might not pass it faster than the Australian government. You know, there's this big bugaboo in the Murdoch press about how bad China is and how authoritarian it is. Not my experience, and I've done a lot of work in China with big companies. I remember working at a big iron and steel company, representing them at a place called Wuhan, which is near and dear to everybody's heart. It is to you because you know about COVID, but it is to me because we adopted a little boy from there. But when the investment bankers, steel experts came out from New York, you know what they said? They said, this place is state of the art. And you know why it was state of the art? Because they've been adopting techniques from the Japanese. And the Japanese, you know where they got it from? They got it from a professor at Columbia by the name of W. Edwards Deming. So there's no incentive for a human being to cause severe harm. The incentive comes in this law, which affects how directors behave. It makes them give up a part of their personhood to fill a role. And the code will change that in a better way.
I want to just one little bit
I think we might need to continue that conversation afterwards because we're starting to fall behind on our little run sheet.
Thanks
if you
for your
wouldn't
help.
mind. Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.
So, yeah.
I want to spread the good news that the discussion does not stop here. We're going to take this discussion further. And one of the places where we can do that is we have a weekly podcast called The Sustainable Hour, where we did already a 1-hour interview that you're welcome to share with others if you want to hear an in-depth perspective on this whole story. We will also be putting what we did here today out on the internet to be shared in social media, first of all as a YouTube video. I just want to mention that the Center for Climate Safety is a blog that puts out all these podcasts every week. And as you can see, our logo is actually, we're telling the opposite story of what's happening. The top one is what's happening. This is what we believe must happen. And I was talking in the beginning about the spirit in the room, our feeling about this, and this feeling that, are we losing? Are we losing? You know, this feeling of losing. We're saying losing is not an option. Because if you think about what the consequences of losing is, just in brief, food shortages, 100 million people without homes, moving around, and our democracy collapsing. This is what the scientists fear if we don't take action very, very soon and do it boldly. And I think the inspiration, Robert, and thank you for this, that you've given us today is that, yes, there is hope. There are things we can do. We just need to have the courage, basically. We need to have the courage to step up and do something. And that's what you have done by coming here tonight.